Good afternoon, everyone. And let me just start by saying we have a terrific panel that I have the privilege of moderating. You've met two of its members already. The third, I'll take a minute to introduce, is Justice Dianne Renwick, the Appellate Division First Department, which that court is considered by many to be the finest commercial appellate court in the country. And I consider Justice Renwick to be one of the finest jurists in the state. She's an inspiration to me, not simply for her work on the bench, but for her devotion both in her professional career has been entirely in the public service, and her personal life is the same. She has really devoted the entirety of herself to helping others. And so with that, let me, the other two panel members you've met, Ms. Carter and Justice Weber, let me kick this off by the observation that you heard from both of the Carters that Eunice really wanted to be a judge and was never able to be a judge. And we do have two judges here and perhaps a judge in waiting, we don't know. And she couldn't. And she couldn't because of racism, certainly, because of sexism, certainly, and because of her brother Alpheus's political views. Now, in reading the book, it struck me that it's sort of unfair to deny somebody a judgeship for which they otherwise would be eminently qualified because of a relative's political views, let alone judging any person by his or her political views. But in listening to Professor Carter, the following idea struck me, that a particularly pernicious thing about prosecuting people for different political views is that members of a minority group are more likely than others to have views that are out of the mainstream. And so it isn't maybe just racism, sexism, and political views. Maybe it's really just racism and sexism in this case. With that framing, what I wanted to start by asking Justices Renwick and Weber is, how did, if at all, racism, sexism, other obstacles, unfairness, affect them as they develop their careers? And do they think now people, let's say in Leah's generation, have it a little bit better, a lot better, not better at all? Maybe start with Justice Renwick.
Well, thank you. And Justice Wilson, Judge Wilson, I first want to thank you for that really lovely introduction. Thank you so much. And I admire you equally. I also want to digress for a moment. And Leah, although I know your father is not here, I want to thank him and you for the excellent lecture and for sharing your family's rich history and revealing this forgotten story of your grandmother's extraordinary life and success, and of the community in which she lived, and the society, or society, as I think your father wrote it in the book. I've been a fan of his since Emperor of Ocean Park, but this was a nonfiction writing. It was real, it was factual, and it's so important to discuss the history of people who have otherwise been written into the shadows. And so I thank you both for bringing her into the limelight, where she belongs, and hopefully will educate us and many others about the history of Blacks and Black lawyers in particular. So thank you. Okay, so for sure, the issues of bias caused by decades of blatant racism and sexism existed explicitly and probably more implicitly at the time in my experience, at the time I graduated law school, which was in 1986, and when I became judge, which was in 1997. But each of these experiences is, I think, is personal. It depends on the path you've taken, sometimes just how implicit or explicit it was. And I guess I was fortunate because, having made my career in the public sector, people there were more liberal-minded, more open-minded, more welcoming of an African-American woman. I began my career in the Bronx, and I began there after having taken a clinic at my law school that was conducted in the Bronx, and the professors had practiced at the Legal Aid Society of the Bronx. So they were able to show the students the ropes in that county. And then when I actually became a lawyer and practiced in the Bronx, I knew many people there already. And so I was sort of guided around. He introduced me and the students to a Black attorney who sort of took us under his wing and made sure we knew everyone. You could go into any part with a senior legal aid attorney and ask for assistance or guidance because they were that welcoming and interested. From there, I went to the federal defenders. I found out about the position because the only Black supervising attorney at the Legal Aid Society whispered to me about an opening, and I applied there. And then when I went to the housing court, again, I was fortunate to have a judge recommend me for the housing court. There were that was an appointed position. After that, I had 2 elected positions and then another appointed position. I was appointed to the housing court by the chief administrative judge, who at the time was Jonathan Lippman, who was committed to appointing women and people of color. So I would say that because of that, because of the path that I took and because of the people I encountered who definitely made it easier. I mean, in some of these experiences and in the readings I've read, where and the things that have happened where court attorneys can be difficult to attorneys by asking them, asking for ID when they're sitting in the well of the court. I know all of that happens for sure, but I had the experience of having African-American court officers in the Bronx criminal court protecting. No one ever would have dared to speak to me in that way or do anything like that. So I had my protectors, fortunately. And as I said, the appointments came from people who were open-minded and coming from a community in the Bronx County, where there's a large number of people of color. So then the people who are the county leaders and otherwise who nominate you happen to be people of color. And the committees are diverse. So I think the statements I'd like to make about that, and the takeaway from my experience at least, is that the mentors are extremely important. Mentors are very important in helping to guide a path for you and helping to educate you about what's important and how to go about achieving the goals that you want. And in addition, the people who are empowered to make these decisions, who nominate people, who appoint people, have so much power, and it depends oftentimes what their political ideology is, because oftentimes whether it's in the states or in the federal court, the more liberally ideology, the more diverse the court, the more willing to make particular appointments. I was born 6 decades after Eunice Carter, and it took 4 more decades after that before the first appointment was made of an African-American woman to the appellate division. That was in 2008, and it was me. And in 2008, I think between 2008 and 2009, several appointments of people of color came. And I would say that's because of the last 3 governors. So is there racism, sexism? Are those things boiled into what we call implicit bias? Absolutely. And does it exist? Absolutely. And and I think I'm fortunate, as I say, because of the path I took at the Legal Aid Society in the Bronx, and having been elected from the Bronx, made a big difference. And I'll let Troy get a word in before I go into statistics and things like that.
And Justice Weber, before you start there, so Eunice Carter thought she had a mentor in Thomas Dewey, and it turned out she didn't. How do you find mentors?
Are you asking me?
Justice Weber, yeah.
Well, to answer your question, I served as a court attorney to William Davis, who was a elected Supreme Court justice in Manhattan after I left the district attorney's office. And so when I became a court attorney, it was never on my radar at all to become a judge. I never thought about it whatsoever. And he was my mentor in that he encouraged me to not only think about becoming a judge, but he actively encouraged me to put in my papers to become a judge, to go the elected route, actually. And so he was my mentor. And so in terms of how do you find a mentor, I was privileged because I worked for him and worked for someone who, thought it important to give back. Also, the Franklin H. Williams Commission, we have a mentor program, and under our mentor program, we do mentor individuals who wish to ascend to the bench. So obviously it's a little easier now for those who are interested in becoming judges, because the Franklin H. Williams Commission has a mentoring program. A couple of the other bar associations have mentoring programs as well. So we do have the ability to reach out to those individuals who want to become judges and to assist them in going on to the bench.
And so, Leah, thinking about your contemporaries, classmates from law school or college who've become lawyers, do you have any sense that your contemporaries of color have it less on their mind to become a judge, or view that as a harder road for them than their, let's say, white male contemporaries, or not?
So this is something that I had conversations with people about. I haven't had a lot of conversations about who wants to be a judge. It may just be the people I know it hasn't come up for. But so I can speak to this a little more theoretically. But one thing I've found in various contexts is that sometimes it can be hard for people. There's certain impressions that you have to think about yourself. And I think to be a judge, one of the things you're supposed to be is objective. And I think in various ways, it is people of color and women are viewed as inherently less objective than white men. So at least that's an experience I've had in various contexts. And so I can see that being, I don't know to what extent it is an obstacle for people, but I could certainly see that as being an obstacle in for people of color who want to become judges.
Let me direct you back to something that Justice Renwick said, that she, when she started out, went into sort of government service, public service, public sector, I think is the way she put it, because people there were more welcoming. My own, thinking back to my law school days or college days, I would have said the same things about my classmates of color, that was an articulated reason, but also if you looked at it, if you just looked at numbers, and I didn't count, but anecdotally, more people of color in my law school class and the classes around it went into some public sector in some way or another than my white classmates, particularly my white male classmates. Do you think that's still true?
I haven't noticed that as a trend. I've certainly known people of various races who've gone into the public sector, but it's not a trend that I've noticed. And I don't know if that's a generational thing or just the people I happen to know.
And so I just want to correct one thing. I didn't go into there because it was more welcoming, but what I found was that it was more welcoming. I went in because I had this excellent experience in my law school clinic.
Well, and also you're an altruist. I think that was probably part of it.
That was the underlying reason.
I was going to say, Judge Wilson, in response to that question, that there are many layers to that. And I had noticed the same when I was in law school, that most of us lawyers of color went into government service or public service. However, now I'm noticing that more are going to firms. And I actually had a conversation about this with my daughter, who graduated last year, and I asked her about this, and she kind of confirmed that more lawyers of color are going to firms. Now that creates a couple of issues. One issue, and let me just back up for a second, the one of the main issues that we've seen is that enrollment of individuals of color is down in law schools. The enrollment numbers are down, and there could be various reasons for that. It could be the fact that it's so costly now to attend law school, but enrollment is down. And what we've seen even more prevalent is that enrollment of Black males in law school is down. So we have fewer Black males who are attending law school, okay? So now, again, I do believe that there are more individuals of color who are going to firms than who are going to government service. The problem we have with that now is that historically, when we were drawing our pool, our pipeline of individuals to become judges on the trial bench, at least, we drew them from court attorneys, from former prosecutors, from former legal aid attorneys. So now, if you have less individuals of color who are going to government positions, you have less individuals who are in the pipeline to become judges, again, at least on the trial bench. And circling back to Black males, we have very few Black males who are in the pipeline now to become judges, and again, individuals of color to become judges as well. So it is a problem. You know, there are positives because yes, they're going to firms, but there's also that negative, which we didn't kind of look at before in terms of that pipeline to the bench.
And can I just say, sorry if I might just add to what Troy said, and I think she touched on it at the end, is that that's a positive. That's a very good thing that we're going to law firms now. What we need to do is focus on how to generate more lawyers of color to come to be lawyers. That's really where I see the issue, and I think that's what what Justice Weber, is saying as well. You know, we sit and admit lawyers all the time in the first department. You can, count on one hand. Sometimes there are no Black men in the pool. Sometimes there are no more than 3. So definitely we see it in real time, firsthand. But I think that we need to increase the number of lawyers, young people becoming lawyers, and that's a real pipeline issue as I see it.
I do note that many of the recent appointees to the federal bench in the New York area have come from law firms. So it's not out of the question that somebody could be crazy enough to go to a law firm and then wind up on the bench.
Yeah, but we do know that there's a difference, although we on the state bench may not wish to admit it, there is a difference between being a judge on the state bench and being a judge on the federal bench. It's the fact that you're there for life, that it's a lifetime appointment. But yes, you do have definitely. But again, that pipeline, we need that pipeline. And so when you and I went to law school, there may have been that the thoughts that you were kind of not being pushed, but government service was more attractive. We need to just find that balance where you're making that decision that you want to go into public interest law, as opposed to you feel that you're not going to be accepted if you go to a law firm.
Former Secretary of Homeland Security Jeh Johnson, who's now at Paul Weiss, issued a report that had been commissioned by the Chief Judge. It's entitled Equal Justice in the New York State Courts. And a couple of months before that, the Judicial Friends Association also submitted a report covering much the same territory. I thought I would start with Justice Weber, because she is on the Franklin Williams Commission, which was originally founded in 1991 as the Commission on Minorities, and the report by Secretary Johnson really, I think, frames its work around the Commission's initial mission. And so I thought I'd start with you there if you had observations about that report or the Judicial Friends report, and sort of a level set on where we are now compared to where we were 30 years ago.
Well, I certainly agree with with most of the findings, as well as the recommendations by Secretary Johnson, as well as the statistics that were put out by the Judicial Friends. They were obviously on point. I will say that we do have issues with the Office of Court Administration in terms of their compiling statistics. So it was rather difficult, it is difficult at times, to really figure out where exactly we are, because there can be a certain lack of transparency in obtaining those statistics. And I know Judicial Friends had problems trying to obtain them, and also I noticed that Secretary Johnson had problems in obtaining them as well. However, I do agree, as I said, with the findings of Secretary Johnson as well as his recommendations. It was certainly a Herculean task, given the time constraints, the fact that he had to conduct most of the interviews via Zoom. It was unfortunate that he wasn't able to actually meet with individuals, the individual employees and the staff at the courthouse in person. The Williams Commission, we've done this in the past where we've gone to the various courthouses, we've met with the supervising judges, we've met with the administrative judges, we've met with the individual employees. And when you meet on a one-to-one basis, it becomes a little bit easier because you have the ability to have a conversation. And in all honesty, they, in fact, perhaps are maybe a little bit more honest with you, at least you'll be able to draw them out perhaps a little bit better than when this is done on Zoom. Unfortunately, the report by Secretary Johnson, as well as the report by the Judicial Friends, simply reinforced much of what we knew or what we suspected. And while we have made great strides in terms of diversity and in terms of maintaining a bias-free court system, there's much that has to be done. As you stated, Franklin Williams rendered his report in the late 80s. And a lot of what Franklin Williams stated in that report are still prevalent today. A lot of those issues are still prevalent today. And so all we can try to do is to work on the recommendations by Secretary Johnson. I know that the Chief Judge is dedicated to implementing change. And, we at the Williams Commission will work together with Mr. David and, in attempts to making sure that, again, we have a bias-free court system.
One thing I wanted to ask Justice Renwick about is something that struck me from the report, which is the report recites the conclusion of the Minorities Commission of Franklin Williams' report from 1991, that there are two justice systems at work in the courts of New York State, one for whites and a very different one for minorities and the poor. And that conclusion, as I read it, was not, that is the currency of that conclusion, was based not so much on the personnel or the makeup of the people in the court system, but on the fact that there are structural impediments, that there are courts, for example, the housing court, the family court, that are so under-resourced and that tend to serve poor people and communities of color, that those people are not getting the kind of justice that we all aspire to. And Secretary Johnson made clear that he was making that observation, though those kinds of changes are outside of his mission. His mission was, what can the courts themselves do? This is something that would need a broader action, legislative action, gubernatorial action. Justice Renwick, do you have any thoughts about that?
So just let me be clear. You mean you're not talking about the conditions of the courts?
Oh, I am.
You are, okay.
Conditions rather than the personnel, right?
Rather than the personnel, right, exactly. I would love to think, just to go back, I would love to think that when I was in the housing court, someone coming in and seeing me and my being able to be compassionate and understanding with that person would have made all the difference. But I have to admit that you are right, because there are statistics that show that a large percent of the Black population doesn't have confidence in judges and otherwise. Now that may be because of the number of the paucity of judges in certain courts. But one of the things that stands out to me is that when I started as a judge in 1997, I had not been in, as much as I had worked in the Bronx, I had not been in the housing court. I worked in the criminal court, which is in a different building. And then as a judge, I had to park at the entrance where one would see first right away the housing court. And it was atrocious. It was really atrocious. It was like cattle, like shuffling cattle. It was just people on top of one another in the hallways, waiting for their cases to be called. It's demoralizing. A new housing court was built, but unfortunately, it was almost too small by the time it was open. And I think that's where we find ourselves now, with structures that, the court system is trying. It was built, I think it opened in 1990, around 1997, I think in 1997, maybe the Bronx Housing Court, for example. But so quickly, the buildings become, too small, just can't handle the capacity anymore. And what do we do about that? We need funding. I mean, there has to be funding to change those kinds of things. But I agree that those kinds of changes demoralize people. They make people feel that they're not worth the courts improving. And it's a tremendous problem. I don't know the solution to that.
I think we definitely need funding, but I will say that I would venture to say that if you had attorneys who were handling commercial cases, or attorneys who were handling trust and estates matters, that if they had to go to a building such as the housing court building, or if they had to go to a building such as family court, and they had to wait in the halls and, in terms of just the general layout, I think there would be an uproar from the bar concerning, concerning the appearance and concerning what was going on. So yes, I certainly agree that it does require funding. However, I do find it interesting that, again, this has been allowed to go on during a period of time when we have had, the court system has had the money, to make these changes. And unfortunately, it does send a message to the litigants, to the individuals who are using the housing court, family court, and criminal court, that they are not as important, or that they are not viewed as important as other litigants.
I agree completely, and I think in the report by Secretary Johnson, he noted that in the commercial parts, there are 3 law secretaries, for example,
Exactly.
Whereas in the housing court, there are none. I completely agree. Perhaps my saying funding is not quite the word. Perhaps it is the resources, but reallocating the resources.
Most definitely. Yeah, I totally agree with you. And in terms of diversity, diversity on the bench is certainly important because, my sitting on the bench, if a litigant walks into the courtroom, a litigant of color or a defendant of color, and I sat on the criminal side for a good portion of my career. So a litigant of color, a defendant of color walks into that courtroom. There's a level of, let's say, comfort. Not that, that my decision is going to be, in their favor just because they're Black and I'm Black, but because I think that they perceive that the system is going to be a little fairer because the judge sitting there is the same color or same ethnicity that they are. So definitely, when I sat criminal, defendants were not pleased, perhaps by the outcome of the case or by the ultimate sentence that I imposed. However, I do believe, and I've been told this actually by defendants, by their families, etc., that they did know that there was that, as I said, there was that comfort level because they knew that I was going to render a fair trial and I was going to give them a fair trial and that the system was going to be fair. Not to say that my white counterparts, are not fair. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm simply saying that where you have a bench that is reflective of the population that the court serves, I think, again, it just gives the perception that the system is fair.
I just want to add to that. I agree. And as I was saying, I would hope that my being there and being compassionate could do that. But when I practiced in the criminal court, I thought I had seen everything. I mean, the courts weren't great by any stretch of the imagination. And I had gone from practicing in the criminal court to going to federal court for 8 years, where everything is gleaming white marble. And then I came back, and that's when I saw the housing court. And there was nothing like it, and no amount of, now I'm sure it absolutely, and we definitely have to have more judges. I'm not suggesting that we don't need it, but the question was whether that alone will make the difference. And that does have to happen. We absolutely need more judges on the bench, but given the condition, it is just not going to do it enough. When people come in and their children are crying and they're asked to leave and the bathrooms are filthy and they're just not treated well, it is a completely demoralizing situation like none I had ever seen in my life. I will say that was 1997. And as I said, there was a new court, but it quickly became, there were too many people. I can't say that I've been in the housing court recently, but I'm going by what I've read in the reports. So I agree with what Justice Weber has said, but I just want to add that footnote.
So we do need to wrap up, and I wanted to go back to Leah and switch topics a little bit. The book chronicles, and I think you and Professor Carter, went through some of the difficulties, adversity that Eunice had to face, but we also have to remember that there were external challenges as well. I mean, she lived through the Spanish influenza as a teenager. She graduated from law school right at the start of the Great Depression. The Scottsboro boys are convicted in 1935 when she's been, just appointed to the DA's office. There's the world that she lived in had a lot of troubles, a lot of challenges, and people today, we have our own pandemic, we have our own economic dislocation, we have a fair measure of political turmoil. What lessons do you think we can take from her in sort of not falling into depression? I don't mean an economic depression, I mean an emotional depression.
That's a great question. I think one of the lessons is remembering that the time we live in isn't as exceptional as we think it is, that all those things you just mentioned, happened. Like we're not the only people to have lived through a pandemic or to have lived through crazy political times. And so I think it can be good to have a little bit of perspective, because sometimes it's like everything is falling apart, completely hopeless, this is the worst things have ever been. And I think having some historical perspective, that similar things have happened before, and that and that we can move on from them. Which is not to say they're not horrible when they happen, but that history keeps going, I guess, and that we can keep moving on through things.
Do you think the arc of history is still bending the right way?
Yeah, no, I've actually been thinking about that phrase recently and which way the arc. I don't know that I don't know that I believe the arc of history necessarily bends in any particular direction, but I think it's our job to try to bend it.
Well said. So with that, thank you to all. It's been a great discussion.